Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about profiling and detecting deception, but this is my 18-year-old cat, Finley, wanted to make a little cameo. I guess since I'm posting on YouTube now, I need to have a pet as part of it. Cats break the internet. She's only going to stay still for like 2 more seconds, so I'm going to put her down and let her run around. So today is the lecture that's I think really interesting and why a lot of people who are interested in how psychology and the law intersect take this course, to be perfectly honest. But also I'll be sort of doing some myth busting. So hopefully you will find this interesting and not too disheartening. So the first things we're going to talk about is profiling. And so behavioral scientists and police do use criminal profiling to narrow criminal investigations to suspects who possess certain behavioral and personality features that were revealed by the way the crime was committed in some way. And obviously this is easier to do if it's a serial crime. It's been done over and over. So most profiling has been done for those who commit bizarre or repeated crimes, rapists, arsonists, sexual homicides, mass and serial murders, killers, things along those lines. So profilers have interviewed those who have committed a specific type of offense in order to learn how they select and approach their victims, how they react to their crimes, what demographic or family characteristics they might share, and what personality features might predominate. So the idea is if you interview people who are perhaps in prison who have committed similar crimes, then you've got some background. So one of the things that I will talk about here is how do we classify these homicide offenders, these people that we're going to end up profiling. So historically, most homicides are committed by killers who know their victim. They're well acquainted with their victim. And they have a personal motive that seems rational to them, whether or not that actually is. Usually they just kill once and then they're arrested. In the past 2 decades, increased attention has been paid to patterns of homicide involving killers who attack multiple victims, sometimes with irrational or bizarre motives. And they're much less likely to be caught than in former days. So multiple homicides were defined by Fox and Levin in 1998 as the slaying of 4 or more victims simultaneously or sequentially. So it could be all at once or over time, what we more typically think of as a serial killer. And it can be done by one or several individuals or a few individuals. The 2 types of multiple homicides that have been identified are mass murders and serial murders. So mass murderers kill 4 or more victims in one location during a few minutes to several hours. So it happens all at once. In almost 80% of mass murders, the assailant knew at least one of the victims, and usually the attack is a very carefully planned assault. The typical assailant is killed at the location of the crime, commits suicide, or will surrender to police. And think about our school shooters that we touched on last time. These are folks that are committing these mass murders, right? Then there are serial murderers, and they kill 4 or more victims, but on separate occasions. And they usually select a certain type of victim, and they're usually strangers, which makes them different than most homicides. And they fulfill a certain role in the killer's fantasies. And these are much better planned usually than mass killings. Serial murderers are often difficult to apprehend. They can seem like they're normal community members for all the reasons that we talked about when we talked about the symptoms of antisocial personality disorder. So Fox and Levin have provided examples of possible motives for people who commit serial and mass murder, and these include power, revenge, loyalty, profit, and terror, which is one thing we don't necessarily think about, but yes, terror is often mass murder, right? Now, how do you do criminal profiling? There are steps that you go through, just like all these other types of processes we've talked about. So you get your profiling inputs. The profiler will collect all the information available about that particular crime. And then you use decision process models. The profiler will organize that input in some logical way. There will be a crime assessment. So on the basis of the findings in step 2, the profiler attempts to reconstruct the behavior of the offender and of the victim. Step 4 is the criminal profile. The profiler formulates an initial description of the most likely suspects. Next is the investigation. A written report is given to the investigators who concentrate on suspects who match the profile. And then hopefully, right, apprehension. Arrest of a suspect allows the profiler to evaluate whether or not their predictions were accurate. Well, this can be helpful in potentially identifying a perpetrator. Profiling, unfortunately, does have many limitations. One of the classic cases that's used to discuss profiling is the Washington, D.C. sniper case. So you had FBI profilers who were psychologists who said that it was one guy acting alone, and in fact, it was a pair of individuals. It was John Allen Muhammad and John Lee Malvo. They said, the profile said this is a young thrill seeker. Muhammad was 41, and he wasn't thrill seeking. His motive was actually political ideology. So as long as investigators are aware of the limitations of profilers, they can be helpful. But you have to be cautious because, again, it narrows down who you're looking at. And if you start looking at the wrong people, you can miss the right person. Inaccurate profiles are unfortunately quite common. And most research on profiling in the past has been conducted in-house by the FBI. So there might be some bias because they hire profilers. Concepts and approaches actually used by profilers are often not objectively and systematically defined. So again, we've been talking about psychology as a science. We want to have scientific method in the way we go about things. Some argue that it lacks enough scientific support necessary to testify in court. So in a 1996 study, 70% of police psychologists questioned the validity of profiling. So the question is, can probable characteristics in offender profiles be based on substantive arguments which support or refute various inferred claims? So they did a study where they looked at different profiles, and of the 4,000 claims studied by criminal profilers, nearly 80% were unsubstantiated. That is, they contained no grounds, warrant, backing, or rebuttal. Moreover, less than 31% of these claims were actually falsifiable. And again, remember, falsifiability is one of the hallmarks of science. Only 25% of statements and profiles were inferences actually about offender characteristics as well. There was what is called a meta-analysis published in 2007. So if you're not familiar with what a meta-analysis is, it is where you take a whole bunch of published studies, and instead of treating each person as a data point, you treat each study as a data point now. So each study comes to be sort of aggregated together, and so you can look at a whole bunch of data all at once. Meta-analyses are really considered sort of one of the gold standards for evaluating things. And I just realized, apologies, that I did have a slide about this. So hopefully you're following along. If not, you can see things here as well. So the meta-analysis that I'm talking about essentially said the predictive ability of criminal profiling is lacking. Then there was a study by Snook et al. In 2007, and this is pretty damaging. So they said that the predictive accuracy, so how good you were at predicting who did the crime based on your profile, between experienced profilers, so people who had gone through psychological training, been trained as profilers, and then college students, so folks like yourselves. They compared these two groups, and there was no statistical difference in predictive ability to predict behavior, criminal behavior, between these two groups. I'm going to say that again. So they looked at these two groups. people who are profilers, work in the field, trained as profilers, versus college students like yourselves. No difference in ability to actually create an accurate predictive profile. Pretty damning, right? So if there's no difference in predicting ability between these so-called professionals and unprofessionals, then it would seem that, again, the value might be lost here. The meta-analysis, however, did show that professional profilers were only slightly better, but they were better at predicting overall offender characteristics. This is, to be expected, is because they have expertise. They should be more familiar with profiling and with the literature surrounding it, offering them a wider range of options, ideas, and hypotheses. If criminal profiling is greater than chance, there should be, again, a statistically significant difference between these two groups, and there just wasn't. So unfortunately, a lot of people get upset when I do this, but if you are thinking of becoming a profiler, there are a lot of other great ways you can be involved as a psychologist, okay? So feel free to email me about them, or whoever your instructor is, to talk about other ways you can be involved. Next thing we're going to talk about is evaluating confessions. So the last PowerPoint we talked about eyewitness testimony and how do you get information from a witness in an accurate way. Similar things are really important when you're getting a confession from an alleged criminal, right? You want to make sure that you are not influencing that person in an undue way. So one of the best known US Supreme Court cases is Miranda versus Arizona. This is where the Miranda rights come from, okay? So this dealt with the problem of coerced confessions. As the result of Miranda, the police must warn suspects of certain rights before starting custodial interrogation. Again, they're Miranda rights. You have a right to remain silent. Anything you can and do may be used against you in the court of law. You have a right to an attorney, so on and so forth. If these procedures are not followed, any damaging admissions made by suspects can't actually be used in the trial. So now if you don't follow the Miranda procedure, read the person their rights, that's just going to be thrown out in court. So really important that you follow it. So this Colorado versus Connolly case is another interesting one. So those who are young or mentally disabled are really much more vulnerable to the tactics of a skillful interrogator, or even sometimes a not skillful interrogator. So for any of you who watched the Netflix show Making a Murderer, I'm thinking about the young man who, not trying to be mean, but just, wasn't very bright, didn't have the highest IQ, and just kind of said whatever the police told him to say and led him into saying, right? So the Supreme Court has stated that a suspect's mental limitations or psychological problems do not necessarily lead to the conclusion that the confession in and of itself was involuntary. In Jackson versus Deno, the Supreme Court held that criminal defendants are entitled to a pre-trial hearing that determines whether or not a confession they made was actually given voluntarily. Only if the judge determines that the confession was voluntary can it be introduced during the trial. Makes sense. In 2000, there was Dickerson v. the U.S., and that was a major challenge to Miranda. However, the Supreme Court actually reaffirmed Miranda. And this is a good example of something called stare decisis or stare decisis. Again, I apologize, my Latin is horrible. But essentially, the court has a preference for maintaining stability in its decisions whenever possible. So it will kind of go with precedent unless there's a big reason to overturn it. However, there have been several court cases that have weakened Miranda rights. Or Miranda requirements, I should say. So Harris v. New York said that confessions that violate Miranda can still be used at trial. Fair v. Michael C. said that confessions by defendants who don't fully understand the Miranda warnings can still be used at a trial because they have been given their rights. Berkemer v. McCarthy said that Miranda doesn't apply unless the suspect is in police custody. So if the person just starts talking on the side of the road, it's all right. And Rhode Island v. Innes said that Miranda doesn't apply unless the defendant is actually being interrogated. So really interesting thing to think about there. So an important thing when thinking about confessions is what is the validity of that evidence? There are two kinds of errors that can happen here, erroneous outcomes, false negatives or false positives. So you can have someone who says they didn't do a crime when in fact they did, but you can also have someone who's innocent essentially be coerced into saying they're guilty. Approximately 250 false confessions have been documented since the Miranda decision. And Casson in 2005 noticed that 25% of people who were exonerated by DNA evidence after serving time had falsely confessed. You can prove a confession false, and there are 4 ways you can do this. First is the suspect could confess to a crime that never actually happened. If you can prove that that crime never actually happened, the person who's supposed to be dead miraculously walks into the courtroom, clearly that's a false confession. 2 is it was physically impossible for the suspect to commit the crime. They were supposed to have kicked someone and they're wheelchair bound because they're paralyzed from the waist down. That's an extreme example, but something along those lines. 3 is that the actual perpetrator is identified with guilt objectively established, so we find the actual perpetrator. And then 4 is that there is evidence, for example, DNA, that establishes the defendant's innocence. So not going to just throw stuff out, but certainly there are ways that someone who falsely confesses can have it overturned. So inside the interrogation room, there are interrogation techniques that are pretty commonly used. One is pre-interrogation softening up of the suspect. So when a suspect arrives, they will subtly exert pressure to talk. They may try to butter them up, try to use flattery, ingratiation, rapport building, do pleasant small talk. Hey, can I get you a coffee? Something along those lines. Then during the interrogation, the police often use what are called negative incentives, accusations. They can actually use evidence fabrications. They can attack the subject's denials to break down a suspect's defenses, lower his or her resistance, and instill feelings of fear, despair, and powerlessness. It makes it more likely someone will confess. You can also use positive inducements to motivate the suspect to see that admission might be in their best interest. So, for example, if you turn on your buddy, then you'll get off lighter. Police are good at obtaining Miranda waivers from suspects, so you don't need your attorney here. You can just sign off on this. And rapport building can be a big part of that. People who lack experience with the criminal justice system and those who are innocent are more likely to waive their rights and submit to questioning because they think, I don't need a lawyer present. The detective's presumption of guilt seems to lead to a process of what's called behavioral confirmation. So the fact that you already think that person's guilty going in is going to affect how you question them, how they interpret the suspect's behavior, and even how the suspect themselves acts, right? You might be very anxious if you're being accused of something, whether or not you actually committed that crime. And of course, their judgment of that suspect's guilt. Juveniles have difficulty understanding the Miranda rights, and defendants age 15 and younger are much more likely to waive their rights and plead guilty, even if there's not strong evidence against them. So in a 2004 study, they found 125 false confession cases, and 33%, a third of them were juveniles for these reasons. So Casson and Reitzman, who is the original author of your text, devised a taxonomy to describe different kinds of false confessions. So there's voluntary, you just say, I did it. There could be a whole bunch of reasons for this. Maybe you're trying to protect someone else. Then there's a compliant false confession, where you just sort of go along with the interrogator's demands to make an incriminating statement, even though you know you're innocent. And then there's the internalized false confession, which is as a result of manipulative interrogations, suspects confess because they have come to believe that they have committed the crime. They actually convince themselves, I did it. So inside the courtroom, once we have this confession, how is it used in court? In cases of disputed confessions, judges almost always decide that confessions are voluntary and thus admissible. Jurors are very influenced by confessions, maybe not surprisingly. They're highly likely to convict defendants who have confessed, even when that confession is false. So cases in which false confessors pled not guilty and then proceeded to trial show that jury conviction rates range from 73% to 81%, pretty high. Jurors fail to discount a confession elicited by high-pressure tactics of interrogators. And this goes back to that fundamental attribution error, where they don't see the external situation as determinant of behavior. That person is a bad person. They actually committed the crime. And people are generally not good at deciding whether a confession is true or false. So how can we reform the system to prevent these false confessions? Recording police interrogations can provide a complete, objective, and reviewable record of how that questioning was conducted, so that can be really important. That can also halt manipulative tactics. And also, on the other hand, frivolous claims by defendants like, oh, they coerced me. You know, if there's video in the room and they were questioned in a perfectly reasonable way, you know, that's going to get thrown out. More than half of all law enforcement agencies now do record at least some of their interrogations, and a handful of states actually mandate videotaping of interrogations. Note then that when the camera is focused on the suspect, observers are more likely to judge the confession as voluntary, interestingly. If the same confession is recorded from a different camera, then not as much. So Lassiter, who's done research in this area, actually recommends what's called an equal focus perspective that allows observers to view both the interrogator and the suspect, and this can reduce bias inherent in recording interrogations. So we used a similar camera setup when I was in training in graduate school for my PhD in clinical psychology. And so we actually had one camera that aimed at the client and then the other camera aimed at the therapist. It was shown split screen on the video when you reviewed it, so you could see both people simultaneously. Similar here. All right, so now we're going to move on to sort of a piece of confessions, which is detecting deception. So how accurately can we detect whether someone is deceiving us or lying? So Bond and DiPaolo in 2006 determined that people are correct only 54% of the time at guessing whether someone's deceiving them. That's hardly more than the flip of a coin, right? People generally have a truth bias, so they are biased towards believing that what they're saying is true. And people who have experience judging deceit are typically actually no better than those with no experience. Although those with experience have less of a truth bias. So how do you determine whether someone is lying or telling you the truth? People have a lot of mistaken beliefs, and when you go and watch The Pilot to Lie to Me, they're going to talk a lot about some of these things in that first episode. But people believe that there are given verbal and nonverbal cues to deception. So for example, people believe if you're looking away when you're talking to someone, that's a sign of lying. But in fact, if you think about it, and if you watch me as I talk on these videos, you'll notice I often kind of look away. So when we look away, we're often thinking, because it's sort of hard to manage doing a difficult cognitive task and maintaining focus on someone at the same time. So that's sort of a misconception. There are very few reliable, obvious nonverbal cues to deception. Now, there are exceptions with micro-expressions, which you'll see again in Lie to Me. And this is perhaps because people who are asked to tell the truth can also be really nervous. Example here is the movie Ocean's 13. They have sort of the nerdy character interview for a job at a casino. They know he's going to be anxious. And so they have him just step on a tack in his shoe with every question, so that he kind of spikes no matter what he's doing. You know, we can be anxious just because we're being questioned, right? So we can look like we're lying when really it's like we're telling the truth, but we're really anxious about it. But there is a lot of success determining verbal cues that can reliably predict deceptive behavior. So a larger amount of reported detail is related to truthful reports. Truth tellers are more likely than liars to say they can't recall certain details. And liars also tend to speak in a higher pitched voice and make more speech errors, or what we would often call slips of the tongue, than truth tellers. One of the ways we can try to detect deception is with what's called cognitive load interviews. And these enhance our ability to tell truth tellers from liars. They mentally tax a person. It becomes difficult to simultaneously answer a question and maintain the lie. So next we're going to talk about what, if you watch TV or movies about the criminal justice system, you probably think is like the gold standard of deception, the polygraph. And unfortunately, as you'll see, this is another place where we're going to poke a lot of holes because there are some problems with it, some major ones. So the polygraph was developed around 1917 by William Marston, who claimed that he could detect lying by noticing increases in subjects' blood pressure. So he said, when you lie, your blood pressure goes up. In the 1930s, John Larson built the forerunner to the modern polygraph that would also measure pulse rate and respiratory changes in addition to blood pressure. The problem with the polygraph is that the physiological manifestations of various negative emotions, so guilt, but also fear or even anger, are all very similar. So just like that situation we just talked about where that guy stepped on the tack and he was in pain, that can be the same sort of manifestation physiologically as someone who's actually lying. Simply being suspected of committing a crime, again, even if you're innocent, can generate a lot of emotions, anger, fear, that will look like lying. So there's a couple different techniques for polygraphs. So there's the control question test, which includes relevant questions that inquire about the crime under investigation, and then also comparison questions that are calculated to induce emotional reactions because they cover common misdeeds. So prior to age 21, did you ever try to hurt someone you disliked? Most people with siblings will probably say yes, right? The expectation is that guilty subjects should, again, have more physiological arousal by the relevant questions, where the innocent subject should be more anxious, show peaks on these things, more by these comparison questions. They're going to think admitting this, that I did something wrong in the past, makes me look like a criminal now. Polygraph techniques can also be used with the guilty knowledge test. And the goal here is to detect the presence of guilty knowledge in the suspect's mind, not to actually detect lying. So you present a series of multiple choice questions. Each alternative would appear equally plausible to an innocent person, but the true criminal will, in theory, be revealed by their heightened physiological reactions that accompany recognition of that guilty knowledge. So, you know, if A is the true information, then everything should spike there. Now, here's where we're going to start poking some holes. The validity of the polygraph. As I just mentioned, it can't distinguish between fear, anger, nervousness, excitement, anger, actual guilt, actual lying, right? Often the questioning methods used are also not standardized. And deceptive suspects can be trained to beat the test by taking countermeasures to avoid detection. You can take, for example, an anti-anxiety medication, and it kind of flattens out all of these things. All this could lead to errors, either the false negatives, believing that a liar is truthful, or the false positives, believing that a truthful subject is lying. The overall accuracy rates are 65%, some better. Now, are they admissible in court? That's really important, right? So in about half the states, a defendant takes a polygraph test with the understanding that the prosecutor will drop the charges if the defendant passes the test, but may use the results in court if the defendant doesn't pass. The other way it can be admitted is when a defendant has passed a polygraph exam and tries to have that evidence considered in an ongoing investigation. In states that permit the polygraph evidence to be used in trials, judges conduct pretrial hearings to determine whether those results are actually admissible in that particular case. And they use the same standards as that Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals case that we've talked about already. So, long story short, polygraphs aren't great. A lot of places they're considered inadmissible in court. There is perhaps a frontier for brain-based lie detection. I do have to say that about 3 years ago, I went to a conference where I went to a presentation about this, and there was a lot of skepticism around this as well. So just heads up on that. So the idea here is that you might be able to put someone through a brain scan and detect when they're lying that way. So functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, uses a giant magnet and kind of creates a video of your brain while you talk or do a task. And it measures blood flow and oxygen utilization in the selected parts of the brain. And different patterns of brain activation are found to be associated with truth-telling and with lying. The accuracy of this method ranges, could be 76%, could be 90%, hard to say at this point. Brainwave analysis, or brain fingerprinting, uses an EEG to record the brain's electrical activity. These are brain patterns, brainwave patterns. They look in particular at what's called the P300 wave. And that's elicited by a stimulus that's meaningful to the subject. So a guilty person, but not an innocent person, would react differently to the critical details of the crime. So this is sort of the brain-based guilty knowledge test. This seems to have an 85 to 95% of accuracy of distinguishing liars from truth tellers when you're in the laboratory in a controlled setting and you're telling people to lie. When you take this out into the field and you try it on actual criminals, the levels of accuracy are around 50%. Chance, flip of a coin, not there yet. Is this admissible in court? Defendants and witnesses may try to introduce these results of these tests to demonstrate innocence or bolster credibility. Judges, again, have to use those same Daubert standards to determine whether or not that scientific evidence is admissible. When the police capture suspects, one of their first acts is to encourage that confession. A confession permits a district attorney or a grand jury to bring charges. Even if the suspect later recants, the confession can still be introduced into the evidence at trial. Many quote-unquote confessions result from, again, this intense questioning by police. So we kind of always have to keep that in our mind. Last thing I'm going to talk about for this section is a study that was published in 2010, and actually it wasn't really a study, as more of a review article, where they talked about where are we in terms of lie detection. And what do lie detection methods have in common? It's 3 assumptions. They say that liars are going to experience stronger emotions, liars may experience higher levels of cognitive load, and liars are inclined to use more and different strategies to make a convincing impression on others. Okay, there's a lot of problems. As we've been mentioning, emotions are not the sole domains of liars. There's a lot of reasons you could be experiencing emotions, right? There's what's called the ostrich effect. People don't necessarily attempt to uncover the truth. They bury their heads in the sand, proverbially, like ostriches, who I believe don't actually ever do that in the wild. So, but this is a saying we have, right? Fabrication can be more tolerable or pleasant, but ignorance is really preferred, right? There is no single cue that people can consistently rely on for lie detection. There's no clue like Pinocchio's nose, right? The differences between liars and truth tellers can be very small, which makes them very difficult to detect. Liars often deliberately attempt to appear credible, right? They're going to take countermeasures to do so, and they'll embed lies in truth. So, for example, they may tell you about their day on Monday, but the crime was committed on Tuesday, but because what they're saying is true, it just didn't happen on that day, it's less likely to sort of ping your lie detection methods. And let's be honest, some people are just better liars than others. Some common errors made by folks in lie detection, again, examining the wrong cues, expecting gaze aversion and fidgeting, not going to work. And we do this because of moral reasoning. We know that lying is wrong in our society, and we say people look away when they're ashamed, so they must look away when they're lying. Again, as we've talked about already, and you'll see in the Lie to Me episode, not so much true. Overemphasis on nonverbal cues. Both verbal and nonverbal are actually really important. Sometimes nonverbal can be very accurate. One study showed that observing only 5 seconds of behavior can result in reasonably reliable inference of psychopathy, that antisocial personality disorder. And sometimes we don't even realize the nonverbal cues that we're giving, right? There's the Othello error, where we too readily interpret certain behaviors, again, things like nervousness, as deception. Again, truth tellers can be really nervous. And again, this is from the Shakespeare play Othello, where Desdemona reacts emotionally when accused, and Othello sees that as guilt. Heuristics or decision rules, just like the profilers' decision rules, we're like, oh, we have these, so they're accurate, so we're good to go. Not always, right? Ignoring interpersonal or intrapersonal differences, right? Differences interpersonally, different people. Intrapersonally, I might act differently depending on the situation, right? Interview techniques. Again, these can impair lie detection. If you accuse someone of lying or hammer them, they tend to clam up. Overconfidence in your lie detection skills. So this is very similar to what we talked about with eyewitnesses. Confidence does not equal correctness here either. So what should we do when we're trying to detect deception? We want to pay attention to all of the cues, especially those that do have research behind them, like the microexpressions you'll see in the Lie to Me episode. We want to pay attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues, and that is going to be more accurate than trying one or the other. We want to consider alternate explanations. What else could be making the person act in this way? We want to take those intrapersonal and interpersonal factors into account. We want to use information gathering interview styles, which is much more effective than sort of an accusatory in your face style. We want to ask unanticipated questions, throw them off guard, something the liar could not have prepared for. Ask them temporal questions. When were they where? And impose cognitive load. Again, lying is more cognitively demanding than truth-telling. So things we've talked about, like with eyewitnesses, having them tell the story in reverse order, asking them to make eye contact while they talk. Again, our natural ability or tendency, even when we're telling the truth, is to shift our eyes, right? And ask event irrelevant questions and see how they react to that as well. So I hope that you all enjoy the episode of Lie to Me. It is based on the work of a psychologist named Paul Ekman. You will find accompanying your assignment a blog where he talks about this episode and the scientific accuracy. So I hope you find that really interesting as well. Other little side note about him, his research is actually partially what the movie Inside Out is based on. So very cool guy. I hope that you all enjoy, and I look forward to reading your assignments.